100 fallacies.
Fallacy 1. A deceptive way of thinking or arguing. 2. An invalid, weak, or in some sense bad argument. Affirming a disjunct fallacy. The affirming a disjunct fallacy occurs when someone incorrectly assumes that an or statement is exclusive when it is actually inclusive. In formal logic, the word or usually means one or the other, or both. The fallacy consists of concluding that one alternative must be false simply because the other is true. Logical form: P or Q. P, therefore not Q. This inference is invalid if the or is inclusive. Example: Sarah is studying mathematics or physics. Sarah is studying mathematics, therefore Sarah is not studying physics. This conclusion is invalid because Sarah could be studying both mathematics and physics. When would it be valid? The inference is valid only if the original statement explicitly means either P or Q, but not both, an exclusive or. Affirming the consequent fallacy. The affirming the consequent fallacy arises when someone assumes that because the consequent of a conditional statement is true, its antecedent must also be true. Logical form: if P, then Q. Q, therefore P. Q may have causes other than P. So this argument is logically invalid. Example: if it is raining, the streets are wet. The streets are wet, therefore it is raining. This argument is invalid because the streets could be wet for many other reasons, such as sprinklers, street cleaning, or melting snow. Another example: if this animal is a dog, then this animal is a mammal. This animal is a mammal, therefore it is a dog. Again, the conclusion does not follow since many mammals are not dogs. Against the person fallacy. The against the person fallacy, more commonly known by its Latin name ad hominem, to the person, occurs when someone attacks the person making an argument instead of addressing the argument itself. Instead of evaluating the evidence or reasoning, attention is diverted to the speaker's character, motives, or personal circumstances. General form: person A makes claim X. Person A has some negative characteristic. Therefore, claim X is false. The truth or falsity of a claim does not depend on the personal qualities of the person presenting it. Example: Emma argues that the city should improve public transportation. Emma has received a speeding ticket. Therefore, her argument should be ignored. Emma's driving record has no logical bearing on whether her proposal is sound. Common forms of personal attacks: abusive, attacking the opponent's character or intelligence; circumstantial, claiming the person's circumstances or interests invalidate the argument; U2 attacks, rejecting an argument because the speaker does not consistently follow their own advice. Example of a U2 argument: Doctor: you should stop smoking. Patient: you smoke too, so your advice is worthless. Even if the doctor is hypocritical, the advice may still be medically correct. Ambiguous argument fallacy, equivocation. The ambiguous argument fallacy, also known as equivocation, occurs when a key word or phrase is used in more than one sense within the same argument. The conclusion appears to follow only because the meaning of the term shifts during the reasoning. General form: word X is used with meaning A. Later, word X is used with meaning B. Therefore, the conclusion seems to follow. Example: a feather is light. What is light cannot be dark. Therefore, a feather cannot be dark. The word light first means not heavy, and then means bright. Anecdotal fallacy. The anecdotal fallacy is committed when someone relies on a personal story or isolated example instead of considering broader evidence or reliable statistics. Anecdotes can be interesting and persuasive, but they do not necessarily represent the general situation. Example: my grandfather smoked every day and lived to be 95. Therefore, smoking is not harmful. A single case does not outweigh extensive scientific evidence. Anthropomorphism fallacy. The anthropomorphism fallacy occurs when human thoughts, emotions, intentions, or motives are incorrectly attributed to animals, objects, natural forces, or machines without sufficient evidence. While anthropomorphism is common in literature and everyday speech, it becomes fallacious when used as evidence or explanation. Example: my computer refuses to cooperate because it is angry with me. A computer does not possess emotions or intentions. Appeal to a cliché fallacy. The appeal to a cliché fallacy occurs when a familiar saying, proverb, or slogan is treated as if it were sufficient evidence for a conclusion. Clichés may contain practical wisdom, but they do not replace careful reasoning or evidence. Example: we should never question this decision because, as the saying goes, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. The proverb alone does not establish that change would necessarily be harmful. Appeal to a false stereotype fallacy. The appeal to a false stereotype fallacy arises when someone bases an argument on an oversimplified or inaccurate stereotype about a group of people. Stereotypes often ignore individual differences and lack adequate evidence. Example: she is an artist, so she must be disorganized. The conclusion relies on a stereotype rather than evidence about the individual. Appeal to accomplishment fallacy. The appeal to accomplishment fallacy occurs when someone's achievements in one area are treated as proof that their opinions are correct in an unrelated field. Success in one domain does not automatically imply expertise in another. Example: he won an Olympic gold medal, so his opinions on economic policy must be correct. Athletic achievement does not establish expertise in economics. Appeal to authority fallacy. Argument from authority. The appeal to authority fallacy occurs when a claim is accepted as true solely because an authority or famous person says it is true, especially when the authority lacks relevant expertise or when evidence is ignored. Expert opinion can be valuable, but it is not infallible. General form: authority A says X. Therefore, X is true. Example: a famous actor says this nutritional supplement is effective. Therefore, it must work. The actor's fame is not evidence of medical expertise. Experts can be wrong. Nevertheless, it is often reasonable to listen to them. A correct form of appeal to authority might look like this: X holds that A is true. X is an authority on the subject. The consensus of authorities agrees with X. Hence, there is presumption that A is true. Such an argument is not conclusive. All the authorities in the world might agree on something that is false. So we should not think that something must be true because the authorities say it is. Yet many of our trusted beliefs rest on the testimony of others. Appeal to consequences fallacy. The appeal to consequences fallacy is committed when someone argues that a statement is or must be true or false because its consequences would be desirable or undesirable, according to most theories of truth. The truth of a proposition does not depend on whether we like its consequences. Example: the belief in reincarnation can have bad consequences. Therefore, the theory of reincarnation is false. An attitude can have bad consequences and still be true. Another example: there must be life after death because otherwise life would be too depressing. Whether the conclusion is comforting has no bearing on whether it is true. Some pragmatists would not agree with these claims. According to them, a belief is true if and only if it is fitting, advantageous, or useful, and whether it is fitting, advantageous, or useful can depend on its consequences. What do you think about this theory of truth? Appeal to emotion fallacy. The appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when someone attempts to persuade by arousing emotions rather than providing relevant evidence or logical reasoning. Emotions can be appropriate in argument, but they should not replace evidence and sound arguments. Example: you should support this proposal because think of all the suffering children. The emotional appeal does not by itself establish that the proposal is the best solution. Another example: the West is committing suicide due to toxic empathy. If you don't believe me, think of all the bad things insane radical leftists have done. Yet another example: we shouldn't raise the taxes because yikes for paying taxes. Appeal to flattery fallacy. The appeal to flattery fallacy is committed when someone uses praise or compliments to persuade another person to accept a claim instead of providing supporting evidence. The compliment is intended to influence judgment rather than address the issue itself. Example: you're one of the smartest people I know, so I'm sure you'll agree with my investment plan. The compliment does not provide evidence that the investment plan is sound. Appeal to force fallacy, appeal to threat fallacy. The appeal to force fallacy, traditionally known as argumentum ad baculum, occurs when someone uses threats, intimidation, or coercion instead of reasons to persuade another person. The argument relies on fear rather than evidence. General form: accept claim X, otherwise you will suffer some negative consequence. Example: you should agree that the manager is right or you may lose your job. The threat does not establish that the manager's position is correct. Appeal to ignorance fallacy. The appeal to ignorance fallacy occurs when someone argues that a claim is true simply because it has not been proven false, or false because it has not been proven true. A lack of evidence is not by itself evidence for the opposite conclusion. General form: there is no proof that P is false, therefore P is true. Or there is no proof that P is true, therefore P is false. Example: no one has proven that extraterrestrial life does not exist, therefore extraterrestrial life exists. The absence of proof does not establish the truth of the claim. Another example: no one has proven that extraterrestrial life does exist, therefore extraterrestrial life does not exist. Appeal to money fallacy. The appeal to money fallacy occurs when someone assumes that a claim, product, or idea must be correct, better, or more valuable simply because it is expensive or associated with wealth. Wealth is not reliable evidence of truth or quality. Example: this investment strategy must be the best because only millionaires use it. Being expensive or associated with wealthy people does not guarantee that something is correct or superior. Appeal to nature fallacy. The appeal to nature fallacy arises when someone argues that something is good, healthy, or morally right simply because it is natural, or bad, unhealthy, or wrong, simply because it is unnatural. Whether something is natural or unnatural tells us little by itself about its value or safety. Example: this herbal remedy must be safe because it is completely natural. Another example: this medicine must be bad because it is unnatural. Many natural substances are poisonous, while many synthetic medicines are safe and effective. Appeal to novelty fallacy. The appeal to novelty fallacy occurs when someone assumes that something is good or better simply because it is new, modern, or recently developed. New ideas and products are not automatically improvements over older ones. Example: we should buy this software because it is the newest version. The latest version may or may not be better, depending on its actual features and performance. Appeal to pity fallacy. The appeal to pity fallacy occurs when someone attempts to win acceptance of a claim by appealing primarily to sympathy or compassion rather than providing relevant evidence. Compassion may be appropriate, but it does not establish the truth of a claim. Example: you should give me an A because I worked very hard and have had a difficult semester. The student's circumstances may deserve sympathy, but they do not determine whether the work meets the required standard. Appeal to the crowd fallacy. The appeal to the crowd fallacy occurs when someone argues that a claim is or must be true because all, many, or most people believe it, or false because few people accept it. Popularity does not determine truth. General form. Most people believe P. Therefore, P is true, or few people believe P. Consequently, P is false. Example, millions of people believe in astrology. Therefore, astrology must be accurate. The number of believers is not, in itself, evidence that the belief is correct. Another example, few people believe that the earth revolves around the sun. Therefore, the proposition that the earth revolves around the sun is false. Before the Copernican revolution, the premise in this argument was true. This does not entail that the conclusion is true. Appeal to the opposition fallacy. The appeal to the opposition fallacy occurs when someone concludes that a claim is or must be true, simply because a disliked opponent rejects it, or false because an opponent supports it. The truth of a proposition does not depend on who agrees or disagrees with it. Example, our political opponents oppose this environmental policy. Therefore, the policy must be a good one. The opponent's disagreement does not by itself establish the policy's merits. Another example, our political opponents believe that we should tax the rich. Hence, it is false that we should tax the rich. Appeal to the people fallacy. The appeal to the people fallacy occurs when someone tries to persuade an audience by appealing to shared values, prejudices, desires, or group identity instead of offering relevant evidence. Unlike the appeal to the crowd fallacy, which emphasizes popularity, this fallacy appeals to what the audience wants to hear or identify with. Example, as hardworking citizens, we all know this proposal is the right one. The appeal to group identity does not provide evidence that the proposal is correct. Appeal to the stone fallacy. The appeal to the stone fallacy arises when someone dismisses an argument as absurd or false without actually refuting it. Simply rejecting a claim is not the same as answering it. Example, that philosophical theory is obviously ridiculous. I'm not even going to discuss it. No reasons are given for rejecting the theory. Appeal to tradition fallacy. The appeal to tradition fallacy occurs when someone argues that a belief or practice is or must be correct simply because it has existed for a long time. Traditions can be valuable, but longevity alone does not prove correctness. Example, we should continue using this method because it has been used for hundreds of years. A long history of use does not guarantee that the method is the best available. Appeal to what is normal fallacy. The appeal to what is normal fallacy occurs when someone assumes that something is good, acceptable, or correct simply because it is common or considered normal, or bad, unacceptable, or incorrect simply because it is not common or not considered normal. What is typical or familiar is not necessarily what is good, ethical, or desirable. And what is unusual is not necessarily bad, unethical, or undesirable. Example, everyone checks their phone while driving occasionally, so it can't be that dangerous. The fact that a behavior is common does not make it safe or acceptable. Another example, it is not normal to be a vegetarian, therefore you shouldn't be a vegetarian. The proposition that it is not normal to be a vegetarian does not entail the proposition that you shouldn't be a vegetarian. Sometimes the word normal is used in a normative sense. In this sense, it is normal that A says the same thing that it ought to be the case that A. In this sense, the proposition that it is normal that A entails the proposition that it ought to be the case that A. But this is trivial. Assertion fallacy, bare assertion fallacy. The assertion fallacy, also known as the bare assertion fallacy, occurs when someone simply states that a claim is true without providing any supporting evidence or argument. Merely asserting a conclusion does not establish its truth. Example: climate change is a hoax. Everyone knows that. No evidence is offered to support the claim. Here is a version of this fallacy, assuming that a view is true solely because it has been repeated often. Association fallacy. The association fallacy occurs when someone asserts or assumes that properties of one thing must also be properties of another thing because they belong to the same group. The association may be positive or negative, but it does not determine the truth or value of the claim or assumption. Example: she is an academic. This professor is an academic and he is a radical leftist. Therefore, she must be a radical leftist. Not all academics are radical leftists. The premises do not entail the conclusion. Availability heuristic fallacy. The availability heuristic fallacy occurs when someone judges the likelihood or importance of an event based on how easily examples come to mind rather than on reliable evidence. Events that are recent, dramatic, or widely reported often seem more common than they really are. Example: I saw several news reports about airplane crashes this week, therefore flying is extremely dangerous. Vivid media coverage may distort perceptions of actual risk. Bandwagon fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy occurs when someone argues that a claim is or must be true, or a choice is or must be good or right or correct simply because it is currently popular or many people believe or do it. Popularity does not determine truth. Example: everyone is investing in cryptocurrency. Therefore, it must be a good investment. The number of people doing something does not prove that it is wise. Begging the question fallacy. The begging the question fallacy is committed when the conclusion is assumed in one of the premises. The argument takes for granted what it is supposed to prove. General form: P is true, therefore P is true. In classical logic, this inference is valid, but it is utterly trivial and does not add any new information. Arguments of the following form are also often thought to be problematic. P is true. P says the same thing as Q, therefore Q is true. Example: it must be the case that all facts are natural. Therefore, it is necessary that all facts are natural. The conclusion is assumed rather than demonstrated. Biased sample fallacy. The biased sample fallacy occurs when someone draws a conclusion from a sample that is not representative of the population being studied. If the sample is biased, the conclusion may be unreliable. Example: I asked 10 people at a fitness club whether they exercise regularly. All answered that they do exercise regularly. Therefore, most people exercise regularly. The sample is not representative of the general population. Bulverism fallacy. Bulverism occurs when someone claims that an argument is flawed because of the arguer's identity, or assumes that an opponent is wrong and immediately explains why they hold the supposedly mistaken belief instead of first showing that the attitude is false. The focus shifts from evaluating the argument to explaining its psychological or social origin. Bulverism combines the genetic fallacy and against the person attacks. Example: you only support free markets because you're wealthy. Even if the explanation were correct, it would not show that the argument for free markets is false. Burden of proof fallacy. The burden of proof fallacy arises when someone demands that others disprove a claim instead of providing evidence for the claim themselves. In rational argumentation, the person making a claim normally bears the burden of supporting it. Example: ghosts exist. Prove that they don't. It is usually taken for granted that the responsibility lies with the person making the positive claim. Cherry-picking fallacy. The cherry-picking fallacy occurs when someone presents only the evidence that supports their conclusion while ignoring relevant evidence that points in the opposite direction. Selective use of evidence can produce misleading conclusions. Example: a company advertises only the positive reviews of its product while ignoring hundreds of negative ones. Another example: this experiment supports this scientific theory. Therefore, this scientific theory is true. A balanced evaluation requires considering all relevant evidence. Chronological snobbery fallacy. The chronological snobbery fallacy occurs when someone assumes that an idea is either true because it is modern or false simply because it is old, or vice versa. The age of an idea does not determine its truth. Example: that philosophical theory, the theory that there are abstract objects, is centuries old, so it must be outdated. Older ideas may still be correct or valuable. Another example: string theory is true, for string theory is the latest widely popular physical theory. The proposition that string theory is the latest widely popular physical theory does not, in itself, entail that string theory is true. Not all new ideas are true. Circular argument fallacy. The circular argument fallacy occurs when the conclusion is indirectly supported by premises that depend upon the conclusion itself. Unlike simple begging the question, the circularity may be less obvious because several intermediate steps are involved. Example: the newspaper is trustworthy because it reports the facts. We know it reports the facts because it is trustworthy. The reasoning ultimately circles back to the original assumption. According to some so-called coherentists, not all circular arguments are bad. What do you think about this view? Circular definition fallacy. The circular definition fallacy is committed when a word is defined using the same word or an equivalent concept, providing no genuine explanation, or when a circular definition is used in an argument. A useful definition should clarify meaning rather than simply repeat it. Example: intelligence is the quality of being intelligent. The definition explains nothing. Circumstantial against the person fallacy. The circumstantial against the person fallacy occurs when someone dismisses an argument because of the speaker's personal circumstances, interests, or background rather than addressing the argument itself. The person's circumstances do not determine whether the argument is sound. Example: of course she supports environmental regulations. She works for an environmental organization. Her employment does not by itself invalidate her arguments. Conjunction fallacy, probability. The conjunction fallacy occurs when someone judges the probability of two events occurring together to be greater than the probability of one of the events occurring alone. According to classical probability theory, a conjunction can never be more probable than one of its components. Example: John regularly goes to church. John voted for the Republicans. Therefore, it is more probable that he is a conservative evangelical Christian than a conservative. Common cause fallacy. The common cause fallacy occurs when someone overlooks the possibility that two correlated events are both caused by a third factor. Instead, they mistakenly assume that one event directly causes the other. Example: ice cream sales increase when drowning incidents increase. Therefore, eating ice cream causes drowning. In reality, hot summer weather is the common cause of both. Complex question fallacy, loaded question. The complex question fallacy, also known as the loaded question fallacy, is committed when a question contains a hidden assumption that has not been established. Any direct answer appears to accept the assumption. The fallacy lies in presupposing something that should first be proved. Example: have you stopped cheating on exams? A simple yes or no answer assumes that the person has cheated in the past. Context disdain fallacy. The context disdain fallacy involves assuming that an idea is false or unreasonable simply because it is put forth in a low-status context. While context can be important, it does not make a valid argument invalid or a sound argument unsound. Example, this theory was published in this obscure journal. Therefore, this theory is false. Context, snobbery fallacy. The context snobbery fallacy occurs when someone assumes that an idea is true or reasonable simply because it is put forth in a prestigious context. Again, while context can be important, it does not make an invalid argument valid or an unsound argument sound. Example, this argument was published in this high-ranked journal. Therefore, this argument is sound. Continuum fallacy, Sorite's fallacy. The continuum fallacy, sometimes called the Sorite's fallacy, occurs when someone argues that because there is no sharp boundary between two categories, the categories themselves do not exist. The absence of a precise dividing line does not eliminate meaningful distinctions. Example, since there is no exact moment when a child becomes an adult, there is no difference between children and adults. Vague boundaries do not imply that the categories are identical. Correlation fallacy. Correlation implies causation fallacy. The correlation fallacy is committed when someone assumes that because two events occur together or are statistically correlated, one must cause the other. Correlation alone does not establish causation. If A and B occur together or are statistically correlated and this correlation is not random, it can be the case that A causes B, that B causes A, or that both A and B are caused by some common cause, C. Example, people who carry lighters are more likely to develop lung cancer. Therefore, carrying a lighter causes lung cancer. The common cause is smoking. Courtier's reply fallacy. The courtier's reply fallacy occurs when someone dismisses criticism by claiming that the critic lacks sufficient expertise or sophistication without addressing the criticism itself. Expertise can be relevant, but merely questioning someone's qualifications does not refute their argument. Example, you cannot criticize this philosophical theory because you have not spent 20 years studying it. In a rational discussion, the criticism should be evaluated on its merits rather than dismissed because of the critic's background. Modal scope fallacy. The modal scope fallacy occurs when someone confuses what is necessarily true of a proposition or description with what is necessarily true of an object described or talked about, or vice versa. The fallacy results from shifting the scope of modal expressions such as necessarily or possibly. Example, it is possible for anyone to win, therefore it is possible for everyone to win. In a few modal systems, this argument is valid, but in most popular systems, it is not. Definist fallacy. The definist fallacy arises when someone attempts to settle a substantive question merely by defining a term in a particular way. Definitions can clarify language, but they cannot by themselves determine facts or resolve philosophical disputes. Example, a real democracy always produces good outcomes. Therefore, if a democracy produces bad outcomes, it is not a real democracy. The conclusion depends on an unusual and arbitrary definition. Denying the antecedent fallacy. The denying the antecedent fallacy occurs when someone incorrectly concludes that because the antecedent of a conditional statement is false, the consequent must also be false. Logical form, if P, then Q, not P. Therefore, not Q. This reasoning is invalid because Q may still be true for other reasons. Example, if it is raining, the streets are wet. It is not raining. Therefore, the streets are not wet. The streets may be wet because of sprinklers, melting snow, or street cleaning. Ecological fallacy. The ecological fallacy is committed when someone draws conclusions about individuals based solely on statistics describing groups. Relationships that hold for groups do not necessarily hold for every individual within those groups. Example, Country A has the highest average income. Therefore, every person living in Country A is wealthy. The average income of a country tells us nothing definite about any particular individual. Etymological fallacy. The etymological fallacy occurs when someone assumes that the current meaning of a word is determined by its historical origin or original meaning. The meanings of words often change over time, so etymology alone does not determine present usage. Example: the word nice originally meant ignorant. Therefore, calling someone nice really means calling them ignorant. The current meaning of nice is quite different from its historical meaning. Fallacy. The fallacy arises when someone concludes that a claim must be false simply because the argument offered in its support is fallacious. A bad argument does not necessarily imply a false conclusion. Example: John gives a poor argument for climate change. Therefore, climate change is not real. The weakness of John's argument says nothing about whether the conclusion is true. False dilemma fallacy. False dichotomy. The false dilemma fallacy, also known as the false dichotomy, occurs when someone presents only two alternatives even though other relevant possibilities exist. The argument artificially limits the available options. Example: either you support this policy or you do not care about public safety. You do not support this policy. Consequently, you do not care about public safety. The argument is valid in classical logic, but the first premise can be criticized. Many other positions are possible. False equivalence fallacy. The false equivalence fallacy arises when someone treats two things as morally, logically, or factually equivalent despite important differences between them. Superficial similarities do not establish genuine equivalence. Example: forgetting to return a library book is just as bad as stealing a car. If this is true and car thieves deserve jail, then if you forget to return a library book, you deserve jail. Car thieves deserve jail. Therefore, you deserve jail if you forget to return a library book. This argument is valid in classical propositional logic, but the first premise can be criticized. The two actions differ greatly in seriousness and consequences. Some ancient Stoics would perhaps question this conclusion. They seem to have believed that all wrong acts are equally wrong. However, this proposition was called a paradox even in ancient times. False fallacy. The false fallacy is committed when someone incorrectly labels a perfectly valid argument as fallacious and dismisses it on that basis. Merely accusing an argument of containing a fallacy does not make it fallacious. Example: she cited the opinion of a qualified medical expert in her argument. That's just an appeal to authority. Therefore, her argument is a fallacy. Appealing to genuine expertise can be reasonable when the authority is relevant and reliable. And an argument that includes an appeal to an authority can be both valid and sound. Some persons that study fallacies become so happy at their newfound knowledge that they begin to label everything as a fallacy. Faulty analogy fallacy. The faulty analogy fallacy occurs when someone argues that because two things are similar in some respects, they must also be similar in another relevant respect, even though the similarities are insufficient. An analogy supports an argument only when the similarities are relevant. Example: employees are like nails. So just as nails work better when hit on the head, employees do too. The analogy ignores important differences between nails and people. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy arises when someone believes that previous independent random events influence the probabilities of future independent events. Independent events do not remember previous outcomes. Example: a coin has landed heads 5 times in a row. Therefore, tails is now more likely. The probability of heads or tails remains 1/2 on the next fair coin toss. Guilt by association fallacy. The guilt by association fallacy occurs when someone rejects a claim or criticizes a person merely because they are associated with another person or group viewed negatively. An association alone does not determine the truth or falsity of a claim. Example: he once attended a meeting organized by a controversial group. Therefore, his economic arguments should be rejected. In a serious discussion, the arguments should be evaluated independently. Hasty generalization fallacy. Overgeneralization. The hasty generalization fallacy, also called overgeneralization, is committed when someone draws a broad conclusion from too little or unrepresentative evidence. Reliable generalizations require adequate evidence. Example: I met two unfriendly tourists from country X. Therefore, people from country X are unfriendly. Two individuals do not represent an entire population. Historian's fallacy. The historian's fallacy arises when someone interprets historical decisions or events as though people in the past possessed the same knowledge that we have today. At least in some contexts, historical actors should be judged in light of the information available to them at the time. Example: the military operation failed, and we know why it had to fail. Consequently, the military commander should have known the military operation would fail. This assumes knowledge that may only have become available afterward. I'm entitled to my opinion fallacy. The I'm entitled to my opinion fallacy occurs when someone suggests that the mere fact that they have a right to hold an opinion makes the opinion reasonable, well-supported, or immune from criticism. People are entitled to their opinions, but not all opinions are equally justified. Example: I have the right to believe that the earth is flat. Therefore, my belief that the earth is flat is right. The right to hold an opinion does not make the opinion true or well supported. Improper composition fallacy. The improper composition fallacy occurs when someone assumes that what is true of the individual parts is or must also be true of the whole. Properties of parts do not always transfer to the entire system. Example: every player on this team is excellent. Therefore, the team must be excellent. Excellent individual players do not necessarily make an excellent team. Improper division fallacy. The improper division fallacy occurs when someone assumes that what is true of the whole is or must also be true of each individual part. Properties of wholes do not always apply to their components. Example: this university is wealthy. Therefore, every student at the university is wealthy. The wealth of the institution does not imply the wealth of each student. Incomplete comparison fallacy. The incomplete comparison fallacy occurs when something is described as faster, healthier, or more effective, without specifying the standard of comparison. Comparative terms require an explicit or implicit comparison. Example: our product is better. Therefore, you should buy our product. Better than what? The comparison is incomplete and does not support the conclusion. Inductive conversion fallacy. The inductive conversion fallacy occurs when someone incorrectly reverses a probabilistic or inductive relationship. The fact that one event makes another likely does not imply that the reverse relationship is equally likely. Example: most professional basketball players are tall. Alex is tall. Therefore, Alex is probably a professional basketball player. While being a basketball player makes it likely that someone is tall, being tall does not make it likely that someone is a professional basketball player. Inflation of conflict fallacy. The inflation of conflict fallacy occurs when someone exaggerates the degree of disagreement between two or more positions, presenting them as fundamentally opposed when they are compatible or differ only in minor respects. The error lies in overstating the conflict instead of recognizing areas of agreement. Example: two climate scientists disagree about the precise rate of warming. Therefore, climate science is deeply divided. The disagreement concerns a specific issue, not the overall scientific consensus. Irrelevant argument fallacy, ignoratio elenchi, or ignoratio elenchi. The irrelevant argument fallacy, traditionally known as ignoratio elenchi, missing the point, arises when someone presents an argument that may be valid in itself but fails to address the issue under discussion. The conclusion does not respond to the question, or claim that is actually being debated. Example: the sun is shining, therefore we should ban texting while driving. Although the proposition that the sun is shining may be true, it is irrelevant to whether texting while driving should be prohibited. Is-ought fallacy. The is-ought fallacy occurs when someone derives a moral or normative conclusion solely from descriptive facts without providing a normative premise. Statements about what is the case do not by themselves establish what ought to be. This is sometimes called the is-ought principle. Example: competition exists throughout nature. Therefore, human society ought to be highly competitive. The conclusion introduces a moral judgment that is not contained in the premise. There are perhaps some exceptions to the is-ought principle, but it seems basically correct. Note that some meta-ethical naturalists probably want to deny the is-ought principle. However, most other meta-ethicists accept some version. Life is art fallacy. The life is art fallacy arises when someone assumes that principles appropriate for artistic expression can be directly applied to ordinary life, morality, or public policy. Art and life often serve different purposes and are evaluated by different standards. Example: great works of literature celebrate tragic heroes who break the rules. Therefore, breaking the rules is admirable in real life. Artistic value does not automatically determine moral value. Ludic fallacy. The ludic fallacy is committed when someone assumes that a simplified mathematical model or game accurately captures the complexity and uncertainty of real-world situations. Models can be useful, but they often omit important variables. Example: our financial model predicts virtually no chance of a market crash. Therefore, a crash is practically impossible. The model may fail to account for unforeseen events or hidden risks. Middle ground fallacy. The middle ground fallacy occurs when someone assumes that the truth must lie somewhere between two opposing positions simply because they disagree. Compromise is not always equivalent to correctness. Example: one person says the earth is round, another says the earth is flat. Therefore, the earth must be somewhere in between. The truth is not determined by averaging opposing claims. Modal fallacy. The modal fallacy arises when someone reasons incorrectly about what is necessary, possible, or impossible by misusing modal concepts or operators. Such errors often involve confusing what is actually true with what is necessarily true, or what is possible with what is actual. Example: it is possible that we will develop a utopia in the future. Therefore, we will develop a utopia in the future. Another example: it is necessary that if you will do it, you will do it, you will do it. Hence, it is necessary that you will do it. Yet another example: it is necessary that you will do it or that you will not do it. Consequently, it is necessary that you will do it or it is necessary that you will not do it. Note: the modal scope fallacy is a specific type of modal fallacy involving the scope of modal operators. Motta and Bailey fallacy. The Motta and Bailey fallacy occurs when someone advances a controversial or difficult-to-defend claim, the Bailey, but retreats to a much weaker and more defensible claim, the Mott, when challenged. Once the criticism has passed, they return to the stronger claim. The strategy creates the appearance that the controversial claim has been defended, when in fact only the weaker claim has. Example: speaker: science is just another opinion. Critic: that cannot be right. Speaker: all I meant is that scientists can make mistakes. The speaker shifts from a controversial claim to a much more modest one. Note that not all retreats are fallacious. It is often reasonable to revise our views in the light of new evidence or new arguments, and to express our views in more nuanced ways. Nitpicking fallacy, trivial objections. The nitpicking fallacy occurs when someone focuses on minor, insignificant, or peripheral details while ignoring the main argument or the central evidence. Small imperfections do not necessarily undermine an otherwise sound argument. Example: the report contains one spelling mistake, therefore its conclusions cannot be trusted. The criticism concerns a trivial detail rather than the substance of the report. No true Scotsman fallacy. The no true Scotsman fallacy occurs when someone responds to a counterexample by arbitrarily redefining a group in order to protect a universal claim. Instead of modifying the original claim, the definition is changed to exclude inconvenient cases. Example: no vegetarian would ever eat fish. Sarah's a vegetarian and she occasionally eats fish. Well, no true vegetarian would do that. The definition is adjusted solely to preserve the original claim. Ought is fallacy. The ought is fallacy occurs when someone assumes that because something ought to be the case, it therefore is the case. The error lies in confusing normative claims about how the world should be with descriptive claims about how the world actually is. According to the ought is principle, we cannot derive any descriptive sentences from a set of consistent, purely normative or moral sentences. General form: A ought to be the case, A is right, or A is good. Therefore, A is the case. Example: a just society ought to treat everyone equally. Therefore, our society treats everyone equally. The conclusion does not follow from the premise. Note that the ought is fallacy is the reverse of the is ought fallacy, which incorrectly derives an ought from an is, and the ought is principle is the reverse of the is ought principle. There are perhaps some exceptions to the ought is principle, but it seems to be correct in most cases. Personal incredulity fallacy. The personal incredulity fallacy arises when someone rejects a claim because they find it difficult to understand, imagine, or believe. A person's inability to comprehend a claim does not show that the claim is false. Example: I cannot imagine how evolution could produce such complex organisms. Therefore, the theory of evolution cannot be true. After this, therefore, because of this fallacy. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, that is, the after this, therefore, because of this fallacy, is committed when someone assumes that because one event occurred before another, the first event must have caused the second. Temporal succession alone does not establish causation. General form: A happened after B. Therefore, A was caused by B. Example: I wore my lucky shirt, then our team won the game. Therefore, my lucky shirt caused the victory. The victory may have had entirely different causes. Pro-con fallacy. The pro-con fallacy occurs when someone assumes that simply listing the advantages or disadvantages of an action or a position is sufficient to determine whether the action is right or the position is correct. Usually, we should consider both arguments for and against an action or a belief before we decide what to do or what to believe. Furthermore, arguments should be evaluated according to the strength and relevance of the evidence, not merely by counting pros and cons. General form: the reasons in favor of A are 1, 2, 3, etc. Therefore, A is right or reasonable, or the reasons against A are 1, 2, 3, etc. Therefore, A is not right or reasonable, or there are more reasons for A than against A. Therefore, A is right or reasonable. Example: if we legalize this drug, our freedom will increase and the state will be able to regulate the drug trade. Therefore, we should legalize this drug. Another example: if we raise the taxes, our disposable income will be reduced and many businesses will move abroad. Therefore, we should not raise the taxes. Yet another example: we have 3 arguments in favor of the proposal and 2 against it. Therefore, the proposal is justified. The number of arguments is less important than their quality. A reasonable form of a pro-con argument might look like this. The reasons in favor of A are 1, 2, 3, etc. The reasons against A are 1, 2, 3, etc. The former reasons outweigh the latter. Therefore, A is right or reasonable. Psychologist's fallacy. The psychologist's fallacy arises when someone assumes that their own perspective, knowledge, or experience accurately reflects the mental processes or experiences of others. The error lies in projecting one's own viewpoint onto other people. Example: it is obvious to me that this is an optical illusion. Therefore, it is obvious to everyone that this is an optical illusion. Different individuals may perceive or interpret the illusion differently. Quantifier shift fallacy. The quantifier shift fallacy occurs when someone incorrectly changes the order or scope of quantifiers such as every, some, all, or there exists, thereby drawing an invalid conclusion. The logical structure of the statement is altered. Example: every student admires some teacher. Therefore, there is one teacher whom every student admires. The conclusion does not follow because different students may admire different teachers. Quoting out of context fallacy. The quoting out of context fallacy is committed when someone selectively quotes a statement while omitting surrounding words or context that significantly change its meaning. The quotation becomes misleading because important information has been removed. Example: an article quotes a scientist as saying, "The treatment is effective ... while omitting the remainder, only in a small number of carefully selected cases. The incomplete quotation gives a false impression of the scientist's conclusion. Red herring fallacy, irrelevant argument. The red herring fallacy occurs when someone introduces an irrelevant issue in order to distract attention from the original topic or argument. The discussion is diverted away from the point that should be addressed. Example: should the city improve public transportation? We should first discuss how much people enjoy driving. The response changes the subject rather than addressing the original question. Retrospective determinism fallacy. The retrospective determinism fallacy arises when someone assumes that because an event has already occurred, it was inevitable or predetermined. Knowing the outcome after the fact can create the illusion that it could not have happened otherwise. Example: after the company went bankrupt, people say it was obvious that bankruptcy was inevitable. Before the event occurred, many different outcomes may still have been possible. Sharpshooter fallacy. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. The sharpshooter fallacy occurs when someone selectively focuses on patterns that support a conclusion while ignoring data that do not fit the pattern. The name comes from the image of a person firing bullets at a barn and then painting a target around the tightest cluster of holes. Example: a financial analyst examines hundreds of stock market indicators and highlights only those that happen to predict last year's market movements. The apparent pattern may simply be the result of selective attention rather than genuine predictive power. Single cause fallacy. Causal oversimplification. The single cause fallacy occurs when someone assumes that a complex event or phenomenon has only one cause, while ignoring other significant contributing factors. Many events have multiple interacting causes. Example: crime exists solely because of poverty. Although poverty may contribute to crime, many other social, economic, and psychological factors may also play important roles. Slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy arises when someone argues that a relatively small first step will inevitably lead to a series of increasingly extreme consequences without providing sufficient evidence for the causal chain. The conclusion assumes an unavoidable progression that has not been established. Example: if we allow students to use calculators in this class, soon they will never learn mathematics. If this is true, we should not allow students to use calculators in this class. Therefore, we should not allow students to use calculators in this class. This argument is valid in classical logic, but the first premise can be criticized. The intermediate steps require additional justification. Special pleading fallacy. The special pleading fallacy is committed when someone applies a general rule to others while making an unjustified exception for themselves or for a favored case. Exceptions require independent justification. Example, everyone should obey the speed limit, but I am special, so the rule doesn't apply to me. No adequate reason is given for the exception. Strawman fallacy. The strawman fallacy occurs when someone misrepresents or oversimplifies an opponent's position so that it becomes easier to criticize. Instead of addressing the actual position, proposition, or argument under discussion, the person attacks a weaker or more extreme version of it. Example, Person A. We should reduce our defense spending slightly. Person B. My opponent wants to eliminate our defense. We should not eliminate our defense. Therefore, my opponent's view is wrong. The second speaker attacks a distorted version of the original position. Suppressed correlative fallacy. The suppressed correlative fallacy occurs when someone defines a concept in a way that ignores or eliminates its natural counterpart, thereby creating a misleading conclusion. Many concepts are meaningful only in relation to their opposites. Example, Person A. Some people are normal. Person B. Everyone has quirks and behaves strangely at times, so no one can actually be called normal. Another example, everything is large to something. Even an ant is large compared to a bacterium. Therefore, nothing is really small. Genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy arises when someone evaluates a claim solely on the basis of its origin, source, or history rather than on its merits. The source of an idea does not determine whether it is true or false. Example, this scientific theory was first proposed by an eccentric thinker. Therefore, it must be false. The theory should be evaluated by its evidence, not by its origin. Perfect ideal fallacy, nirvana fallacy. The perfect ideal fallacy, often called the nirvana fallacy, arises when someone rejects a realistic solution because it is not perfect. Real-world alternatives should be compared with one another, not with unattainable ideals. Example, seat belts do not prevent every traffic fatality, therefore they are not worth using. The fact that a measure is imperfect does not mean that it is ineffective. Tokenism fallacy. The tokenism fallacy is committed when someone points to a single exceptional case or symbolic example as evidence that a broader problem no longer exists. Isolated examples do not necessarily reflect general conditions. Example, a woman became CEO of one of the largest companies in the world last year. Therefore, gender discrimination in business has disappeared. A single example does not establish a general conclusion. Tone policing fallacy. The tone policing fallacy occurs when someone dismisses an argument because of the speaker's tone, style, or emotional expression rather than addressing the substance of the argument. The manner of presentation does not determine whether the argument is sound. Example, I won't consider your concerns because you seem too angry. The speaker's emotional tone does not by itself invalidate the argument. True but trivial fallacy. The true but trivial fallacy occurs when someone responds to an important issue by presenting a statement that is true but trivial and irrelevant or too insignificant to address the main point. The statement distracts from the substantive issue. Example, Person A. We should discuss how to reduce climate change. Person B. Well, the climate has always changed, so we do not have to do that. Although the statement that the climate has always changed is true, it is trivial and does not address the specific issue under discussion. U2 fallacy. The U2 fallacy, traditionally known as tu quoque, arises when someone rejects an argument by accusing the speaker of hypocrisy instead of addressing the argument itself. A person's inconsistency does not determine whether their claim is true. Example: Doctor, you should exercise more. Patient, you don't exercise either, so no, I shouldn't. The doctor's personal behavior is irrelevant to whether the advice is good. Of course, all of these claims are compatible with the proposition that it is sometimes justified or right to criticize others for inconsistency or hypocrisy. Two wrongs make a right fallacy. The two wrongs make a right fallacy occurs when someone attempts to justify one wrongful action by pointing to another wrongful action. The existence of one wrong does not justify committing another. Example: they cheated during the competition, therefore we are justified in cheating as well. The conclusion does not follow. Undistributed middle fallacy. The undistributed middle fallacy arises when two categories are incorrectly linked because they both share a third category, even though that shared category is not fully distributed. The logical connection is invalid. Logical form: all A are C, all B are C, therefore all A are B. Example: all dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all dogs are cats. Sharing a common category does not imply identity, inclusion, or overlap. Clearly, the premises in the example are true while the conclusion is false. Wishful thinking fallacy. The wishful thinking fallacy occurs when someone believes that a claim is true simply because they strongly want it to be true. Desires and hopes do not constitute evidence. Example: I really want my favorite team to win, therefore they probably will. The likelihood of an outcome is often independent of personal wishes. Word salad fallacy. The word salad fallacy occurs when someone presents language that sounds profound, technical, or sophisticated but lacks clear meaning or logical coherence. Complex vocabulary should not be mistaken for a valid argument. Example: immanent phenomenal consciousness both transcends and introjects the multidimensional isomorphic quantum resonance of existential harmonics. In an ego-logical movement that both differentiates and integrates parts of the nominal self in a temporal hyperstructure that cuts through the modal fabric of the world. Therefore, the mind can exist without the body. Although the premise sounds impressive, it fails to communicate a clear or logically meaningful claim, and the conclusion does not follow from it. Note that not all words and expressions that may sound sophisticated, unfamiliar, or strange are meaningless. Various sciences and philosophical schools have developed highly technical vocabularies that include many well-defined concepts not found in everyday conversation.